Thimble, Thimble, by O. Henry. These are the directions for finding the eye office of Carteret and Amp. Carteret, mill supplies and leather belting. You follow the Broadway trail down until you pass the cross-down line, the bread line, and the dead line, and come to the big cannons of the money grubber tribe. Then you turn to the left, to the right, dodge a pushcart and the tongue of a 2-ton, 4-horse dray and hop, skip, and jump to a granite ledge on the side of a 21-story synthetic mountain of stone and iron. In the 12th story is the office of Carteret and Amp, Carteret. The factory where they make the mill supplies and leather belting is in Brooklyn. Those commodities, to say nothing of Brooklyn not being of interest to you, let us hold the incidents within the confines of a one-act, one-scene play, thereby lessening the toil of the reader and the expenditure of the publisher. So, if you have the courage to face 4 pages of type in Carteret and Amp, Carteret office boy, Percival, you shall sit on a varnished chair in the inner office and peep at the little comedy of the old nigger man, the hunting case watch, and the open-faced question mostly borrowed from the late Mr. Frank Stockton, as you will conclude. First, biography, but paired to the quick, must intervene. I am for the inverted sugar-coated quinine pill the bitter on the outside. The Carterets were, or was, Columbia College professors please rule, an old Virginia family. Long time ago the gentlemen of the family had worn lace ruffles and carried tinless foils and owned plantations and had slaves to burn. But the war had greatly reduced their holdings. Of course you can perceive at once that this flavor has been shoplifted from Mr. F. Hopkinson Smith, in spite of the E.T. after Carter. Well, anyhow, in digging up the Carteret history I shall not take you farther back than the year 1620. The 2 original American Carterets came over in that year, but by different means of transportation. One brother, named John, came in the Mayflower and became a pilgrim father. You've seen his picture on the covers of the Thanksgiving magazines, hunting turkeys in the deep snow with a blunderbuss. Blandford Carteret, the other brother, crossed the pond in his own brigantine, landed on the Virginia coast, and became an FFE. John became distinguished for piety and shrewdness in business. Blandford for his pride, juleps, marksmanship, and vast slave-cultivated plantations. Then came the Civil War. I must condense this historical interpolation. Stonewall Jackson was shot. Lee surrendered. Grant toured the world. Cotton went to 9 cents. Old Crow whiskey and Jim Crow cars were invented. The 79th Massachusetts Volunteers returned to the 97th Alabama Zouaves the battle flag of Lundy's Lane, which they bought at a second-hand store in Chelsea kept by a man named Skinsky. Georgia sent the president a 60-pound watermelon, and that brings us up to the time when the story begins. My, but that was sparring for an opening. I really must brush up on my Aristotle. The Yankee Carterets went into business in New York long before the war. Their house, as far as leather belting and mill supplies was concerned, was as musty and arrogant and solid as one of those old East India tea importing concerns that you read about in Dickens. There were some rumors of a war behind its counters, but not enough to affect the business. During and after the war, Blandford Carteret, FFV, lost his plantations, juleps, marksmanship, and life. He bequeathed little more than his pride to his surviving family. So it came to pass that Blandford Carteret, the 5th, aged 15, was invited by the Leather and Mill Supplies branch of that name to come north and learn business instead of hunting foxes and boasting of the glory of his fathers on the reduced acres of his impoverished family. The boy jumped at the chance, and, at the age of 25, sat in the office of the firm equal partner with John, the 5th, of the Blunderbuss and Turkey branch. Here the story begins again. The young men were about the same age, smooth of face, alert, easy of manner, and with an air that promised mental and physical quickness. They were razored, blue-serged, straw-hatted, and pearl stick-pinned like other young New Yorkers who might be millionaires or bill clerks. One afternoon at 4 o'clock, in the private office of the firm, Blandford Carteret opened a letter that a clerk had just brought to his desk. After reading it, he chuckled audibly for nearly a minute. John looked around from his desk inquiringly. "It's from Mother," said Blandford. "I'll read you the funny part of it. She tells me all the neighborhood news first, of course, and then cautions me against getting my feet wet in musical comedies. After that comes some vital statistics about calves and pigs and an estimate of the wheat crop. And now I'll quote some. And what do you think? Old Uncle Jake, who was 76 last Wednesday, must go traveling. Nothing would do, but he must go to New York and see his young marster Blandford. Old as he has a deal of common sense, so I've let him go. I couldn't refuse him. He seemed to have concentrated all his hopes and desires into this one adventure into the wide world. You know he was born on the plantation and has never been 10 miles away from it in his life. And he was your father's body servant during the war and has been always a faithful vassal and servant of the family. He has often seen the gold watch, the watch that was your father's and your father's father's. I told him it was to be yours, and he begged me to allow him to take it to you and to put it into your hands himself. So he has it carefully enclosed in a buckskin case and is bringing it to you with all the pride and importance of a king's messenger. I gave him money for the round trip and for a 2-week stay in the city. I wish you would see to it that he gets comfortable quarters. Won't need much looking after, he's able to take care of himself. But I have read in the papers that African bishops and colored potentates generally have much trouble in obtaining food and lodging in the Yankee metropolis. That may be all right, but I don't see why the best hotel there shouldn't take Jake in. Still, I suppose it's a rule. I gave him full directions about finding you and packed his valise myself. You won't have to bother with him, but I do hope you'll see that he is made comfortable. Take the watch that he brings you, it's almost a decoration. It has been worn by true Carterets, and there isn't a stain upon it nor a false movement of the wheels. Bringing it to you is the crowning joy of old Jake's life. I wanted him to have that little outing and that happiness before it is too late. You have often heard us talk about how Jake, pretty badly wounded himself, crawled through the reddened grass at Chancellorsville to where your father lay with the bullet in his dear heart and took the watch from his pocket to keep it from the Yanks. So, my son, when the old man comes, consider him as a frail but worthy messenger from the old-time life and home. You have been so long away from home and so long among the people that we have always regarded as aliens that I'm not sure that Jake will know you when he sees you. But Jake has a keen perception, and I rather believe that he will know a Virginia Carteret at sight. I can't conceive that even 10 years in Yankee land could change a boy of mine. Anyhow, I'm sure you will know Jake. I put 18 collars in his valise. If he should have to buy others, he wears a number 15.5. Please see that he gets the right ones. He will be no trouble to you at all. If you are not too busy, I'd like for you to find him a place to board where they have white meal cornbread, and try to keep him from taking his shoes off in your office or on the street. His right foot swells a little, and he likes to be comfortable. If you can spare the time, count his handkerchiefs when they come back from the wash. I bought him a dozen new ones before he left. He should be there about the time this letter reaches you. I told him to go straight to your office when he arrives. As soon as Blandford had finished the reading of this, something happened, as there should happen in stories and must happen on the stage. Percival, the office boy, with his air of despising the world's output of mill supplies and leather belting, came in to announce that a colored gentleman was outside to see Mr. Blandford Carteret. "Bring him in," said Blandford, rising. John Carteret swung around in his chair and said to Percival, "Ask him to wait a few minutes outside. We'll let you know when to bring him in." Then he turned to his cousin with one of those broad, slow smiles that was an inheritance of all the Carterets, and said, "Bland, I've always had a consuming curiosity to understand the differences that you haughty Southerners believe to exist between you all and the people of the North. Of course, I know that you consider yourselves made out of finer clay and look upon Adam as only a collateral branch of your ancestry, but I don't know why. I never could understand the differences between us." "Well, John," said Blandford, laughing, "what you don't understand about it is just the difference, of course. I suppose it was the feudal way in which we lived that gave us our lordly baronial airs and feeling of superiority." "But you are not feudal now," went on John. "Since we licked you and stole your cotton and mules, you've had to go to work just as we damn Yankees, as you call us, have always been doing. And you're just as proud and exclusive and upper-classy as you were before the war. So it wasn't your money that caused it." "Maybe it was the climate," said Blandford lightly, "or maybe our Negroes spoiled us. I'll call old Jake in now. I'll be glad to see the old villain again." "Wait just a moment," said John. "I've got a little theory I want to test. You and I are pretty much alike in our general appearance. Old Jake hasn't seen you since you were 15. Let's have him in and play fair, and see which of us gets the watch. The old Darkasuri ought to be able to pick out his young marster without any trouble. The alleged aristocratic superiority of a Reb ought to be visible to him at once. He couldn't make the mistake of handing over the timepiece to a Yankee, of course. The loser buys the dinner this evening and 2 dozen 15.5 collars for Jake. Is it a go? Blandford agreed heartily. Percival was summoned and told to usher the colored gentleman in. Uncle Jake stepped inside the private office cautiously. He was a little old man, as black as soot, wrinkled and bald except for a fringe of white wool, cut decorously short, that ran over his ears and around his head. There was nothing of the stage uncle about him. His black suit nearly fitted him. His shoes shone, and his straw hat was banded with a gaudy ribbon. In his right hand, he carried something carefully concealed by his closed fingers. Uncle Jake stopped a few steps from the door. 2 young men sat in their revolving desk chairs 10 feet apart and looked at him in friendly silence. His gaze slowly shifted many times from one to the other. He felt sure that he was in the presence of one, at least, of the revered family among whose fortunes his life had begun and was to end. One had the pleasing but haughty Carteret air. The other had the unmistakable straight, long family nose. Both had the keen black eyes, horizontal brows, and thin, smiling lips that had distinguished both the Carteret of the Mayflower and him of the Brigantine. Old Jake had thought that he could have picked out his young master instantly from 1,000 northerners, but he found himself in difficulties. The best he could do was to use strategy. "Howdy, Moss Blandford, howdy, Sue," he said, looking midway between the 2 young men. "Howdy, Uncle Jake." They both answered pleasantly and in unison. "Sit down. Have you brought the watch?" Uncle Jake chose a hard-bottomed chair at a respectful distance, sat on the edge of it, and laid his hat carefully on the floor. The watch in its buckskin case he gripped tightly. He had not risked his life on the battlefield to rescue that watch from his old marsters, foes to hand it over again to the enemy without a struggle. "Yes, Sue. I got it in my hand, Sue. I'm gwine give it to you right away in just a minute. Old Missus told me to put it in young Moss Blandford's hand and tell him to wear it for the family pride and honor. It was a mighty longsome trip for an old nigger man to make, 10,000 miles. It must be, back to old Virginia, Sue. You've growed mightily, young marster. I wouldn't have recognized you but for your powerful resemblance to old marster." With admirable diplomacy, the old man kept his eyes roaming in the space between the 2 men. His words might have been addressed to either. Though neither wicked nor perverse, he was seeking for a sign. Blandford and John exchanged winks. "I reckon you done got you ma's letter," went on Uncle Jake. "She said she was gwine to write to you about my comin' along up this way." Yes, Uncle Jake," said John briskly. "My cousin and I have just been notified to expect you. We are both Carterets, you know." "Although one of us," said Blandford, "was born and raised in the North." "So if you will hand over the watch," said John. "My cousin and I dash," said Blandford. "Well then see to it," said John. "That comfortable quarters are found for you," said Blandford. With creditable ingenuity, old Jake set up a cackling, high-pitched, protracted laugh. He beat his knee, picked up his hat and bent the brim in an apparent paroxysm of humorous appreciation. The seizure afforded him a mask behind which he could roll his eyes impartially between, above, and beyond his 2 tormentors. "I sees what," he chuckled after a while. "You gen'lemen is tryin' to have fun with the poo old nigger, but you can't fool old Jake. I knowed you, Moss Blandford, the minute I sot eyes on you. You was a skimpy little boy no mo than about 14 when you left home to come no teach. But I knowed you the minute I sot eyes on you. You was the mortal image of old marster. The other gen'leman resembles you mightily, Sue, but you can't fool old Jake on a member of the old Virginia family. No, Sue." At exactly the same time, both Carterets smiled and extended a hand for the watch. Uncle Jake's wrinkled, black face lost the expression of amusement to which he had vainly twisted it. He knew that he was being teased, and that it made little real difference, as far as its safety went, into which of those outstretched hands he placed the family treasure. But it seemed to him that not only his own pride and loyalty, but much of the Virginia Carterets was at stake. He had heard down south during the war about that other branch of the family that lived in the north and fought on the other side, and it had always grieved him. He had followed his old marster's fortunes from stately luxury through war to almost poverty, and now, with the last relic and reminder of him, blessed by old Missus, and entrusted implicitly to his care, he had come 10,000 miles, as it seemed, to deliver it into the hands of the one who was to wear it and wind it and cherish it and listen to it tick off the unsullied hours that marked the lives of the Carterets of Virginia. His experience and conception of the Yankees had been an impression of tyrants, low-down, common trash, in blue, laying waste with fire and sword. He had seen the smoke of many burning homesteads almost as grand as Carteret Hall ascending to the drowsy southern skies. And now he was face to face with one of them, and he could not distinguish him from his young marster, whom he had come to find and bestow upon him the emblem of his kingship even as the arm, clothed in white samite, mystic, wonderful laid Excalibur in the right hand of Arthur. He saw before him two young men, easy, kind, courteous, welcoming, either of whom might have been the one he sought. Troubled, bewildered, sorely grieved at his weakness of judgment, old Jake abandoned his loyal subterfuges. His right hand sweated against the buckskin cover of the watch. He was deeply humiliated and chastened. Seriously, now, his prominent, yellow-white eyes closely scanned the two young men. At the end of his scrutiny, he was conscious of but one difference between them. One wore a narrow black tie with a white pearl stickpin. The other's four-in-hand was a narrow blue one pinned with a black pearl. And then, to old Jake's relief, there came a sudden distraction. Drama knocked at the door with imperious knuckles, and forced comedy to the wings, and drama peeped with a smiling but set face over the footlights. Percival, the hater of mill supplies, brought in a card, which he handed, with the manner of one bearing a cartel, to Blue Tie. Olivia de Ormond read Blue Tie from the card. He looked inquiringly at his cousin. "Why not have her in," said Black Tie, "and bring matters to a conclusion?" "Uncle Jake," said one of the young men, "would you mind taking that chair over there in the corner for a while? A lady is coming in on some business. We'll take up your case afterward." The lady whom Percival ushered in was young and petulantly, decidedly, freshly, consciously, and intentionally pretty. She was dressed with such expensive plainness that she made you consider lace and ruffles as mere tatters and rags. But one great ostrich plume that she wore would have marked her anywhere in the army of beauty as the wearer of the merry helmet of Navarre. Miss de Ormond accepted the swivel chair at Blue Tie's desk. Then the gentleman drew leather-upholstered seats conveniently near, and spoke of the weather. "Yes," said she, "I noticed it was warmer, but I mustn't take up too much of your time during business hours. That is," she continued, "unless we talk business." She addressed her words to Blue Tie, with a charming smile. "Very well," said he. "You don't mind my cousin being present, do you? We are generally rather confidential with each other, especially in business matters." "Oh no," caroled Miss de Ormond. "I'd rather he did hear. He knows all about it, anyhow. In fact, he's quite a material witness because he was present when it happened. I thought you might want to talk things over before any action is taken, as I believe the lawyers say. Have you anything in the way of a proposition to make?" asked Black Tie. Miss de Ormond looked reflectively at the neat toe of one of her dull kid pumps. "I had a proposal made to me," she said. "If the proposal sticks, it cuts out the proposition. Let's have that settled first." "Well, as far as—" began Blue Tie. "Excuse me, cousin," interrupted Black Tie, "if you don't mind my cutting in." And then he turned, with a good-natured air, toward the lady. "Now, let's recapitulate a bit," he said cheerfully. "All three of us, besides other mutual acquaintances, have been out on a good many larks together." "I'm afraid I'll have to call the birds by another name," said Miss de Ormond. "All right," responded Black Tie, with unimpaired cheerfulness. "Suppose we say squabs when we talk about the proposal and larks when we discuss the proposition. You have a quick mind, Miss de Ormond. 2 months ago some half-dozen of us went in a motor car for days run into the country. We stopped at a roadhouse for dinner. My cousin proposed marriage to you then and there. He was influenced to do so, of course, by the beauty and charm which no one can deny that you possess. I wish I had you for a press agent, Mr. Carteret, said the beauty with a dazzling smile. You are on the stage, Mr. Ormond, went on Black Tie. You have had, doubtless, many admirers, and perhaps other proposals. You must remember, too, that we were a party of merrymakers on that occasion. There were a good many corks pulled. That the proposal of marriage was made to you by my cousin we cannot deny. But hasn't it been your experience that, by common consent, such things lose their seriousness when viewed in the next day's sunlight? Isn't there something of a code among good sports, I use the word in its best sense, that wipes out each day the follies of the evening previous? Oh yes, said Mr. Ormond. I know that very well, and I've always played up to it. But as you seem to be conducting the case, with the silent consent of the defendant, I'll tell you something more. I've got letters from him repeating the proposal, and they're signed too. I understand, said Black Tie gravely. What's your price for the letters? I'm not a cheap one, said Mr. Ormond, but I had decided to make you a rate. You both belong to a swell family. Well, if I am on the stage, nobody can say a word against me truthfully, and the money is only a secondary consideration. It isn't the money I was after. I believed him and I liked him. She cast a soft, entrancing glance at Blue Tie from under her long eyelashes. And the price? Went on Black Tie, inexorably. $10,000, said the lady, sweetly. Or the fulfillment of the engagement to marry. I think it is time, interrupted Blue Tie, for me to be allowed to say a word or two. You and I, cousin, belong to a family that has held its head pretty high. You have been brought up in a section of the country very different from the one where our branch of the family lived. Yet both of us are Carterets, even if some of our ways and theories differ. You remember, it is a tradition of the family that no Carteret ever failed in chivalry to a lady or failed to keep his word when it was given. Then Blue Tie, with frank decision showing on his countenance, turned to Mr. Ormond. Olivia, said he, on what date will you marry me? Before she could answer, Black Tie again interposed. It is a long journey, said he, from Plymouth Rock to Norfolk Bay. Between the 2 points we find the changes that nearly 3 centuries have brought. In that time the old order has changed. We no longer burn witches or torture slaves. And today, we neither spread our cloaks on the mud for ladies to walk over nor treat them to the ducking stool. It is the age of common sense, adjustment, and proportion. All of us ladies, gentlemen, women, men, northerners, southerners, lords, caitiffs, actors, hardware drummers, senators, pod carriers, and politicians are coming to a better understanding. Chivalry is one of our words that changes its meaning every day. Family pride is a thing of many constructions. May show itself by maintaining a moth-eaten arrogance in cobwebbed colonial mansion or by the prompt paying of one's debts. Now, I suppose you've had enough of my monologue. I've learned something of business and a little of life. And I somehow believe, cousin, that our great-great-grandfathers, the original Carterets, would endorse my view of this matter. Black Tie wheeled around to his desk, wrote in a checkbook and tore out the check, the sharp rasp of the perforated leaf making the only sound in the room. He laid the check within easy reach of Mr. Ormond's hand. Business is business, said he. We live in a business age. There is my personal check for $10,000. What do you say, Mr. Ormond? Will it heat orange blossoms or cash? Mr. Ormond picked up the cheek carelessly, folded it indifferently, and stuffed it into her glove. Oh, this'll do, she said, calmly. I just thought I'd call and put it up to you. I guess you people are all right, but a girl has feelings, you know. I've heard one of you was a Southerner. I wonder which one of you it is? She arose, smiled sweetly, and walked to the door. There, with a flash of white teeth and a dip of the heavy plume, she disappeared. Both of the cousins had forgotten Uncle Jake for the time, but now they heard the shuffling of his shoes as he came across the rug toward them from his seat in the corner. Young marster, he said, take your watch. And without hesitation he laid the ancient timepiece in the hand of its rightful owner. The World and the Door, by O. Henry. A favorite dodge to get your story read by the public is to assert that it is true, and then add that truth is stranger than fiction. I do not know if the yarn I am anxious for you to read is true, but the Spanish purser of the fruit steamer El Carrero swore to me by the shrine of Santa Guadalupe that he had the facts from the U.S. Vice Consul at La Paz, a person who could not possibly have been cognizant of half of them. As for the adage quoted above, I take pleasure in puncturing it by affirming that I read in a purely fictional story the other day the line, "Be it so," said the policeman. Nothing so strange has yet cropped out in truth. When Ferguson Hedges, millionaire promoter, investor, and man about New York, turned his thoughts upon matters convivial, and word of it went down the line. Bouncers took a precautionary turn at the Indian clubs, waiters put ironstone china on his favorite tables, cab drivers crowded close to the curbstone in front of all-night cafes, and careful cashiers in his regular haunts charged up a few bottles to his account by way of preface and introduction. As a money power, a one millionaire is of small account in a city where the man who cuts your slice of beef behind the free lunch counter rides to work in his own automobile. But Hedges spent his money as lavishly, loudly, and showily as though he were only a clerk squandering a week's wages. And, after all, the bartender takes no interest in your reserve fund. He would rather look you up on his cash register than in Bradstreet. On the evening that the material allegation of facts begins, Hedges was bidding dull care begone in the calm company of 5 or 6 good fellows, acquaintances and friends who had gathered in his wake. Among them were 2 younger men, Ralph Merriam, a broker, and Wade, his friend. 2 deep-sea cabmen were chartered. At Columbus Circle they hove to long enough to revile the statue of the great navigator, unpatriotically rebuking him for having voyaged in search of land instead of liquids. Midnight overtook the party marooned in the rear of a cheap CAF far uptown. Hedges was arrogant, overriding and quarrelsome. He was burly and tough, iron gray but vigorous, good, for the rest of the night. There was a dispute, about nothing that matters, and the 5-fingered words were passed, the words that represent the glove cast into the lists. Merriam played the RLE of the verbal hotspur. Hedges rose quickly, seized his chair, swung it once and smashed wildly doubt at Merriam's head. Merriam dodged, drew a small revolver and shot Hedges in the chest. The leading roisterer stumbled, fell in a wry heap, and lay still. Wade, a commuter, had formed that habit of promptness. He juggled Merriam out a side door, walked him to the corner, ran him a block, and caught a hansom. They rode 5 minutes and then got out on a dark corner and dismissed the cab. Across the street, the lights of a small saloon betrayed its hectic hospitality. "Go in the back room of that saloon," said Wade, "and wait. I'll go find out what's doing and let you know. You may take 2 drinks while I am gone, no more." At 10 minutes to 1 o'clock Wade returned. "Brace up, old chap," he said. "The ambulance got there just as I did. The doctor says he's dead. You may have 1 more drink. You let me run this thing for you. You've got to skip. I don't believe a chair is legally a deadly weapon. You've got to make tracks. That's all there is to it." Merriam complained of the cold querulously and asked for another drink. "Did you notice what big veins he had on the back of his hands?" he said. "I never could stand. I never could." "Take 1 more," said Wade, "and then come on. I'll see you through." Wade kept his promise so well that at 11 o'clock the next morning Merriam, with a new suitcase full of new clothes and hairbrushes, stepped quietly on board a little 500-ton fruit steamer at an East River pier. The vessel had brought the season's first cargo of limes from Port Limon and was homeward bound. Merriam had his bank balance of $2,800 in his pocket in large bills, and brief instructions to pile up as much water as he could between himself and New York. There was no time for anything more. From Port Limon Merriam worked down the coast by schooner and sloop to Cologne, thence across the isthmus to Panama, where he caught a tramp bound for Callao and such intermediate ports as might tempt the discursive skipper from his course. It was at La Paz that Merriam decided to land. La Paz the Beautiful, a little harborless town smothered in a living green ribbon that banded the foot of a cloud-piercing mountain. Here the little steamer stopped to tread water while the captain's dory took him ashore that he might feel the pulse of the coconut market. Merriam went too, with his suitcase, and remained. Kalb, the vice-consul, a Greco-Armenian citizen of the United States, born in Hessen-Darmstadt, and educated in Cincinnati ward primaries, considered all-Ameri, Kansas brothers and bankers. He attached himself to Merriam's elbow, introduced him to everyone in La Paz who wore shoes, borrowed $10, and went back to his hammock. There was a little wooden hotel on the edge of a banana grove, facing the sea, that catered to the tastes of the few foreigners that had dropped out of the world into the Cape Peruvian town. At Calb's introductory, shake hands with, he had obediently exchanged manual salutations with a German doctor, one French and two Italian merchants, and 3 or 4 Americans who were spoken of as gold men, rubber men, mahogany men, anything but men of living tissue. After dinner, Merriam sat in a corner of the broad front galleria with Bibb, a Vermonter interested in hydraulic mining, and smoked and drank Scotch smoke. The moonlit sea, spreading infinitely before him, seemed to separate him beyond all apprehension from his old life. The horrid tragedy in which he had played such a dis's true's part now began, for the first time since he stole on board the fruiter, a wretched fugitive, to lose its sharper outlines. Distance lent assuagement to his view. Bibb had opened the floodgates of a stream of long-dammed discourse, overjoyed to have captured an audience that had not suffered under 100 repetitions of his views and theories. "1 year more," said Bibb, "and I'll go back to God's country. Oh, I know it's pretty here, and you get dolce far niente banded to you in chunks, but this country wasn't made for a white man to live in. You've got to have to plug through snow now and then, and see a game of baseball and wear a stiff collar and have a policeman cuss you. Still, La Paz is a good sort of a pipe-dreamy old hole, and Mrs. Conant is here. When any of us feels particularly like jumping into the sea, we rush around to her house and propose. It's nicer to be rejected by Mrs. Conant than it is to be drowned, and they say drowning is a delightful sensation." "Many like her here?" asked Merriam. "Not anywhere," said Bibb with a comfortable sigh. "She's the only white woman in La Paz. The rest range from a dappled dun to the color of a B-flat piano key. She's been here a year. Comes from, well, you know how a woman can talk. Ask 'em to say string, and they'll say crow's foot, or cat's cradle. Sometimes you'd think she was from Oshkosh, and again from Jacksonville, Florida, and the next day from Cape Cod." "Mystery," ventured Merriam. Well, she looks it, but her talk's translucent enough. But that's a woman. I suppose if the Sphinx were to begin talking, she'd merely say, 'Goodness me, more visitors coming for dinner, and nothing to eat but the sand which is here.' But you won't think about that when you meet her, Merriam. You'll propose to her too." To make a hard story soft, Merriam did meet her and propose to her. He found her to be a woman in black with hair the color of a bronze turkey's wings, and mysterious, remembering eyes that looked as if she might have been a trained nurse looking on when Eve was created. Her words and manner, though, were translucent, as Bibb had said. She spoke, vaguely, of friends in California and some of the lower parishes in Louisiana. The tropical climate and indolent life suited her. She had thought of buying an orange grove later on. La Paz, all in all, charmed her. Merriam's courtship of the Sphinx lasted 3 months, although B did not know that he was courting her. He was using her as an antidote for remorse, until he found, too late, that he had acquired the habit. During that time, he had received no news from home. Wade did not know where he was, and he was not sure of Wade's exact address, and was afraid to write. He thought he had better let matters rest as they were for a while. One afternoon, he and Mrs. Conant hired 2 ponies and rode out along the mountain trail as far as the little cold river that came tumbling down the foothills. There they stopped for a drink, and Merriam spoke his piece, he proposed, as Bibb had prophesied. Mrs. Conant gave him one glance of brilliant tenderness, and then her face took on such a strange, haggard look that Merriam was shaken out of his intoxication and back to his senses. "I beg your pardon, Florence," he said, releasing her hand, "but I'll have to hedge on part of what I said. I can't ask you to marry me, of course. I killed a man in New York, a man who was my friend. Shot him down, in quite a cowardly manner, I understand. Of course, the drinking didn't excuse it. Well, I couldn't resist having my say, and I'll always mean it. I'm here as a fugitive from justice, and I suppose that ends our acquaintance." Mrs. Conant plucked little leaves assiduously from the low-hanging branch of a lime tree. I suppose so, she said in low and oddly uneven tones. But that depends upon you. I'll be as honest as you were. I poisoned my husband. I am a self-made widow. A man cannot love a murderess. So I suppose that ends our acquaintance. She looked up at him slowly. His face turned a little pale, and he stared at her blankly, like a deaf and dumb man who was wondering what it was all about. She took a swift step toward him, with stiffened arms and eyes blazing. "Don't look at me like that," she cried, as though she were in acute pain. "Curse me, or turn your back on me, but don't look that way. Am I a woman to be beaten? If I could show you, here on my arms and on my back are scars, and it has been more than a year, scars that he made in his brutal rages. A holy nun would have risen and struck the fiend down. Yes, I killed him. The foul and horrible words that he hurled at me that last day are repeated in my ears every night when I sleep. And then came his blows, and the end of my endurance. I got the poison that afternoon. It was his custom to drink every night in the library before going to bed a hot punch made of rum and wine. Only from my fair hands would he receive it, because he knew the fumes of spirits always sickened me. That night when the maid brought it to me, I sent her downstairs on an errand. Before taking him his drink, I went to my little private cabinet and poured into it more than a teaspoonful of tincture of aconite, enough to kill 3 men, so I had learned. I had drawn $6,000 that I had in bank, and with that and a few things in a satchel, I left the house without anyone seeing me. As I passed the library, I heard him stagger up and fall heavily on a couch. I took a night train for New Orleans, and from there I sailed to the Bermudas. I finally cast anchor in La Paz. And now what have you to say? Can you open your mouth? Merriam came back to life. "Florence," he said earnestly, "I want you. I don't care what you've done. If the world—" "Ralph," she interrupted, almost with a scream, "be my world." Her eyes melted. She relaxed magnificently and swayed toward Merriam, so suddenly that he had to jump to catch her. Dear me, in such scenes how the talk runs into artificial prose. But it can't be helped. It's the subconscious smell of the footlight smoke that's in all of us. Stir the depths of your cook's soul sufficiently, and she will discourse in Bulwer litanies. Merriam and Mrs. Conant were very happy. He announced their engagement at the Hotel Orilla del Marche. 8 foreigners and 4 native Astors pounded his back and shouted insincere congratulations at him. Pedrito, the Castilian-mannered barkeep, was goaded to extra duty until his agility would have turned a Boston cherry phosphate clerk a pale lilac with envy. They were both very happy. According to the strange mathematics of the god of mutual affinity, the shadows that clouded their pasts when united became only half as dense instead of darker. They shut the world out and bolted the doors. Each was the other's world. Mrs. Conant lived again. The remembering look left her eyes. Merriam was with her every moment that was possible. On a little plateau, under a grove of palms and calabash trees, they were going to build a fairy bungalow. They were to be married in 2 months. Many hours of the day, they had their heads together over the house plans. Their joint capital would set up a business in fruit or woods that would yield a comfortable support. "Good night, my world," would say Mrs. Conant every evening when Merriam left her for his hotel. They were very happy. Their love had, circumstantially, that element of melancholy in it that it seems to require to attain its supremest elevation. And it seemed that their mutual great misfortune or sin was a bond that nothing could sever. One day a steamer hove in the offing. Bare-legged and bare-shouldered La Paz scampered down to the beach, for the arrival of a steamer was their loop-the-loop, circus, Emancipation Day, and 4 o'clock tea. When the steamer was near enough, Wise Ones Pro claimed that she was the Pajero, bound up coast from Callao to Panama. The Pajero put on brakes a mile offshore. Soon a boat came bobbing shoreward. Merriam strolled down on the beach to look on. In the shallow water, the Carib sailors sprang out and dragged the boat with a mighty rush to the firm shingle. Out climbed the purser, the captain, and 2 passengers, plowing their way through the deep sand toward the hotel. Merriam glanced toward them with the mild interest due to strangers. There was something familiar to him in the walk of one of the pa singers. He looked again, and his blood seemed to turn to strawberry ice cream in his veins. Burly, arrogant, debonair as ever, Ferguson Hedges, the man he had killed, was coming toward him 10 feet away. When Hedges saw Merriam, his face flushed a dark red. Then he shouted in his old, bluff way, "Hello, Merriam. Glad to see you. Didn't expect to find you out here. Quinby, this is my old friend Merriam, of New York. Merriam, Mr. Quinby." Merriam gave Hedges and then Quinby an ice-cold hand. "BRRR," said Hedges. "But you've got a frapped flipper. Man, you're not well. You're as yellow as a Chinaman. Malarial here? Steer us to a bar if there is such a thing, and let's take a prophylactic." Merriam, still half comatose, led them toward the Hotel Arilla del March. "Quinby and I," explained Hedges, puffing through the slippery sand, "are looking out along the coast for some investments. We've just come up from Concepcion and Valparaiso and Lima. The captain of this side-sized ferry boat told us there was some good picking around here in silver mines. So we got off. Now, where's that CAF, Merriam? Oh, in this portable soda water pavilion?" Leaving Quinby at the bar, Hedges drew Merriam's side. "Now, what does this mean?" he said with gruff kindness. "Are you sulking about that fool row we had?" "I thought," stammered Merriam, "I heard, they told me you were, that I had." "Well, you didn't and I'm not," said Hedges. "That fool young ambulance surgeon told Wade I was a did 8 for a coffin just because I'd got tired and quit breathing. I laid up in a private hospital for a month, but here I am, kicking as hard as ever. Wade and I tried to find you, but couldn't. Now, Merriam, shake hands and forget it all. I was as much to blame as you were, and the shot really did me good. I came out of the hospital as healthy and fit as a cab horse. Come on, that drink's waiting." "Old man," said Merriam, brokenly, "I don't know how to thank you. Well, you know." "Oh, forget it," boomed Hedges. "Quinby'll die of thirst if we don't join him." Bibb was sitting on the shady side of the gallery waiting for the 11 o'clock breakfast. Presently Merriam came out and joined him. His eye was strangely bright. "Bibb, my boy," said he, slowly waving his hand. "Do you see those mountains and that sea and sky and sun shine? They're mine, Bibbsy, all mine." "You go in," said Bibb, "and take 8 grains of quinine right away. It won't do in this climate for a man to get to thinking he's Rockefeller, or James O'Neill either." Inside, the purser was untying a great roll of newspapers, many of them weeks old, gathered in the lower ports by the Pajaro to be distributed at casual stopping places. Thus do the beneficent voyagers scatter news and entertainment among the prisoners of sea and mountains. Tio Pancho, the hotel proprietor, set his great silver-rimmed 80 ojos upon his nose and divided the papers into a number of smaller rolls. A barefooted muchacho dashed in, desiring the post of messenger.
"Bienvenido," said Tio Pancho.
This to Señora Conant, that to El Dr. S. Schlegel, Dios. What a name to say. That to Sayer Davis, one for Don Alberto.
Tese tu for de casa de huéspedes, número 6, en la calle de las Buenas Gracias.
And say to them all, muchacho, that the Pajaro sails for Panama at 3 this afternoon. If any have letters to send by the post, let them come quickly, that they may first pass through the Correo. Mrs. Conant received her roll of newspapers at 4 o'clock. The boy was late in delivering them, because he had been deflected from his duty by an iguana that crossed his path, and to which he immediately gave chase. But it made no hardship, for she had no letters to send. She was idling in a hammock in the patio of the house that she occupied, half awake, half happily dreaming of the paradise that she and Merriam had created out of the wrecks of their pasts. She was content now for the horizon of that shimmering sea to be the horizon of her life. They had shut out the world and closed the door. Merriam was coming to her house at 7. After his dinner at the hotel, she would put on a white dress and an apricot-colored lace mantilla, and they would walk an hour under the coconut palms by the lagoon. She smiled contentedly and chose a paper at random from the roll the boy had brought. At first the words of a certain headline of a Sunday newspaper meant nothing to her. They conveyed only a visualized sense of familiarity. The largest type ran thus: Lloyd B. Conant secures divorce. And then the subheadings: well-known St. Louis paint manufacturer wins suit, pleading 1 year's absence of wife. Her mysterious disappearance recalled. Nothing has been heard of her since. Twisting herself quickly out of the hammock, Mrs. Conant's eye soon traversed the half-column of the recall. It ended thus: it will be remembered that Mrs. Conant disappeared one evening in March of last year. It was freely rumored that her marriage with Lloyd B. Conant resulted in much unhappiness. Stories were not wanting to the effect that his cruelty toward his wife had more than once taken the form of physical abuse. After her departure, a full bottle of tincture of aconite, a deadly poison, was found in a small medicine cabinet in her bedroom. This might have been an indication that she meditated suicide. It is supposed abandoned such an intention if she possessed it and left her home instead. Mrs. Conant slowly dropped the paper and sat on a chair, clasping her hands tightly. "Let me think, oh God, let me think," she whispered. "I took the bottle with me. I threw it out of the window of the train. There was another bottle in the cabinet. There were two, side by side, the aconite and the valerian that I took when I could not sleep. If they found the aconite bottle full, why, but he is alive, of course. I gave him only a harmless dose of valerian. I am not a murderess, in fact. Ralph, zero God, don't let this be a dream." She went into the part of the house that she rented from the old Peruvian man and his wife, shut the door, and walked up and down her room swiftly and feverishly for half an hour. Merriam's photograph stood in a frame on a table. She picked it up, looked at it with a smile of exquisite tenderness, and dropped 4 tears on it. And Merriam only 20 rods away. Then she stood still for 10 minutes, looking into space. She looked into space through a slowly opening door. On her side of the door was the building material for a castle of romance, love, an arcady of waving palms, a lullaby of waves on the shore of a haven of rest, respite, peace, a lotus land of dreamy ease and security, a life of poetry and heart's ease and refuge. Romanticist, will you tell me what Mrs. Conant saw on the other side of the door? You cannot? That is, you will not? Very well, then listen. She saw herself go into a department store and buy 5 spools of silk thread and 3 yards of gingham to make an apron for the cook. "Shall I charge it, ma'am?" asked the clerk. As she walked out, a lady whom she met greeted her cordially. "Oh, where did you get the pattern for those sleeves, dear Mrs. Conant?" she said. At the corner, a policeman helped her across the street and touched his helmet. "Any callers?" she asked the maid when she reached home. "Mrs. Waldron," answered the maid, "and the TQO Mrs. Jenkinson." "Very well," she said. "You may bring me a cup of tea, Maggie." Mrs. Conant went to the door and called Angela, the old Peruvian woman. "If Mateo is there, send him to me." Mateo, a half-breed, shuffling and old but efficient, came. "Is there a steamer or a vessel of any kind leaving this coast tonight or tomorrow that I can get passage on?" she asked. Mateo considered. "At Punta Rena, 30 miles down the coast, Señora," he answered. "There is a small steamer loading with cinchona and dyewoods. She sails for San Francisco tomorrow at sunrise. So says my brother, who arrived in his sloop today, passing by Punta Rena. You must take me in that sloop to that steamer tonight. Will you do that?" "Perhaps." Mateo shrugged a suggestive shoulder. Mrs. Conant took a handful of money from a drawer and gave it to him. "Get the sloop ready behind the little point of land below the town," she ordered. "Get sailors, and be ready to sail at 6 o'clock. In half an hour bring a cart partly filled with straw into the patio here, and take my trunk to the sloop. There is more money yet. Now hurry." For one time Mateo walked away without shuffling his feet. "Angela," cried Mrs. Conant, almost fiercely, "come and help me pack. I am going away. Out with this trunk. My clothes first. Stir yourself. Those dark dresses first. Hurry." From the first, she did not waver from her decision. Her view was clear and final. Her door had opened and let the world in. Her love for Merriam was not lessened, but it now appeared a hopeless and unrealizable thing. The visions of their future that had seemed so blissful and complete had vanished. She tried to assure herself that her renunciation was rather for his sake than for her own. Now that she was cleared of her burden, at least, technically, would not his own weigh too heavily upon him? If she should cling to him, would not the difference forever silently mar and corrode their happiness? Thus she reasoned. But there were 1,000 little voices calling to her that she could feel rather than hear, like the hum of distant, powerful machinery, the little voices of the world, that, when raised in unison, can send their insistent call through the thickest door. Once while packing, a brief shadow of the lotus dream came back to her. She held Merriam's picture to her heart with one hand, while she threw a pair of shoes into the trunk with her other. At 6 o'clock Matteo returned and reported the sloop ready. He and his brother lifted the trunk into the cart, covered it with straw, and conveyed it to the point of embarkation. From there, they transferred it on board in the sloop story. Then Matteo returned for additional orders. Mrs. Conant was ready. She had settled all business matters with Angela and was impatiently waiting. She wore a long, loose black silk duster that she often walked about in when the eveninos were chilly. On her head was a small round hat, and over it the apricot-colored lace mantilla. Dusk had quickly followed the short twilight. Matteo led her by dark and grass-grown streets toward the point behind which the sloop was anchored. On turning a corner, they beheld the Hotel Arilla del Mar 3 streets away, nebulously aglow with its array of kerosene lamps. Mrs. Conant paused, with streaming eyes. I must see him once before I go," she murmured in anguish. But even then she did not falter in her decision. Quickly she invented a plan by which she might speak to him, and yet make her departure without his knowing. She would walk past the hotel, ask someone to call him out and talk a few moments on some trivial excuse, leaving him expecting to see her at her home at 7. She unpinned her hat and gave it to Matteo. "Keep this and wait here till I come," she ordered. Then she draped the mantilla over her head as she usually did when walking after sunset, and went straight to the Arilla del March. She was glad to see the bulky, white-clad figure of Tio Pancho standing alone on the gallery. "Tio Pancho," she said, with a charming smile, "may I trouble you to ask Mr. Merriam to come out for just a few moments that I may speak with him?" Tio Pancho bowed as an elephant bows. "Buenas tardes, Señora Conant," he said, as a cavalier talks, and then he went on, less at his ease. "But does not the Señora know that Sayer Merriam sailed on the Pajaro for Panama at 3 o'clock of this afternoon? The Whirligig of Life, by O. Henry." Justice O.F. the Peace Benaja Widdop sat in the door of his office smoking his elder stem pipe. Halfway to the zenith the Cumberland Range rose blue-gray in the afternoon haze. A speckled hen swaggered down the main street of the settlement, cackling foolishly. Up the road came a sound of creaking axles, and then a slow cloud of dust, and then a bull cart bearing Ramsay Bilbro and his wife. The cart stopped at the justice's door, and the two climbed down. Ramsay was a narrow 6 feet of sallow brown skin and yellow hair. The imperturbability of the mountains hung upon him like a suit of armor. The woman was calicoed, angled, snuff-brushed, and weary with unknown desires. Through it all gleamed a faint protest of cheated youth unconscious of its loss. The justice of the peace slipped his feet into his shoes, for the sake of dignity, and moved to let them enter. "We all," said the woman, in a voice like the wind blowing through pine boughs, "wants a devotee." She looked at Ramsay to see if he noted any flaw or ambiguity or evasion or partiality or self-partisanship in her statement of their business. "A devotee," repeated Ramsay, with a solemn tone. "We all can't get along together nohow. It's lonesome enough fur to live in the mountains when a man and a woman keers fur one another. But when she's a spittin' like a wildcat or a sullenin' like a hoot owl in the cabin, a man ain't got no call to live with her. When he's a no-count varmint," said the woman, "without any especial warmth, a traipsin' along of scalawags and moonshiners and a-layin' on his back pizen ith Cohen whiskey, and a pesterin' folks with a pack o' hungry, triflin' hounds to feed. When she keeps a throwin' skillet lids, came Ramsay's antiphony, and slings beilin' water on the best coon dog in the Cumberlands, and sets herself agin cookin' a man's vittles, and keeps him awake o' nights accusin' him of a sight of doin's. When he's allies of fightin' the revenues, and gets a hard name in the mountains for a mean man, who's gwine to be able fur to sleep o' nights? The justice of the peace stirred deliberately to his duties. He placed his one chair and a wooden stool for his petitioners. He opened his book of statutes on the table and scanned the index. Presently he wiped his spectacles and shifted his inkstand. The law and the statutes, said he, ere silent on the subject of divorcee, as far as the jurisdiction of this coat air concerned. But, according to equity and the Constitution and the Golden Rule, it's a bad bargain that can't run both ways. If a justice of the peace can marry a couple, it's plain that he is bound to be able to divorcee him. This here office will issue a decree of divorcee and abide by the decision of the Supreme Court to hold it good. Ramsay Bilbrough drew a small tobacco bag from his trousers pocket. Out of this he shook upon the table a $5 note. Sold a bearskin and 2 foxes' fur that, he remarked. It's all the money we got. The regular price of a divorcee in this coat, said the justice, ere $5. He stuffed the bill into the pocket of his homespun vest with a deceptive air of indifference. With much bodily toil and mental travail, he wrote the decree upon half a sheet of foolscap, and then copied it upon the other. Ramsay Bilbrough and his wife listened to his reading of the document that was to give them freedom. Know all men by these presents that Ramsay Bilbrough and his wife, Uriella Bilbrough, this day personally appeared before me and promises that hereinafter they will neither love, honor, nor obey each other, neither for better nor worse, being of sound mind and body, and accept summons for divorce according to the peace and dignity of the state. Herein fail not. So help you God. Benajah Widdop, Justice of the Peace in and for the County of Piedmont, State of Tennessee. The justice was about to hand one of the documents to Ramsay. The voice of Uriella delayed the transfer. Both men looked at her. Their dull masculinity was confronted by something sudden and unexpected in the woman. Judge, don't you give him that air paper yet. 'Tain't all settled, nohow. I got to have my rights first. I got to have my alimony. 'Tain't no kind of a way to do for a man to divorcee his wife, 'thout her having a cent fur to do with. I'm a-layin' off to be a-goin' up to Brother Ed's up on Hogback Mountain. I'm bound fur to hev a par of shoes and some snuff and things besides. Ef Rance kin affo to divorcee, let him pay me alimony. Ramsay Bilbrough was stricken to dumb perplexity. There had been no previous hint of alimony. Women were always bringing up startling and unlooked-for issues. Justice Benajah Widdop felt that the point demanded judicial decision. The authorities were also silent on the subject of alimony, but the woman's feet were bare. The trail to Hogback Mountain was steep and flinty. Uriella Bilbrough, he asked in official tones, how much did you low would be good and sufficient alimony in the case befo the coat? I lowed, she answered, fur the shoes and all, to say $5. That ain't much fur alimony, but I reckon that'll get me to up Brother Ed's. The amount, said the justice, air not unreasonable. Ramsay Bilbrough, you air ordered by the court to pay the plaintiff the sum of $5 befo the decree of divorcee air issued. I hain't no o' money, breathed Ramsay heavily. I done paid you all I had. Otherwise, said the justice, looking severely over his spectacles, you err in contempt of coat. I reckon if you gimme till tomorrow, pleaded the husband, I mout be able to rake or scrape it up somewhars. I never looked for to be a-payin' no alimony. The case air adjourned, said Benajah Widdop, till tomorrow, when you all will present yourselves and obey the order of the court, following of which the decrees of divorcee will be delivered. He sat down in the door and began to loosen a shoestring. We might as well go down to Uncle Zea's, decided Ramsay, and spend the night. He climbed into the cart on one side, and Uriella climbed in on the other. Obeying the flap of his rope, the little Red Bull slowly came around on a tack, and the cart crawled away in the nimbus arising from its wheels. Justice of the Peace Benajah Widdop smoked his elder stem pipe. Late in the afternoon he got his weekly paper and read it until the twilight dimmed its lines. Then he lit the tallow candle on his table and read until the moon rose, marking the time for supper. He lived in the double log cabin on the slope near the girdled poplar. Going home to supper, he crossed a little branch darkened by a laurel thicket. The dark figure of a man stepped from the laurels and pointed a rifle at his breast. His hat was pulled down low, and something covered most of his face. "I want yo money," said the figure, "'thout any talk. I'm gettin' nervous, and my fingers a-wobblin' on this here trigger." "I've only got $5, said the justice, producing it from his vest pocket. "Roll it up," came the order, "and stick it in the end of this here gun barrel." The bill was crisp and new. Even fingers that were clumsy and trembling found little difficulty in making a spill of it and inserting it, this with less ease, into the muzzle of the rifle. "Now I reckon you can be going along," said the robber. The justice lingered not on his way. The next day came the little Red Bull, drawing the cart to the office door. Justice Benajah Widdop had his shoes on, for he was expecting the visit. In his presence, Ramsay Bilbrough handed to his wife a $5 bill. The official's eye sharply viewed it. It seemed to curl up as though it had been rolled and inserted into the end of a gun barrel. But the justice refrained from comment. It is true that other bills might be inclined to curl. He handed each one a decree of divorce. Each stood awkwardly silent, slowly folding the guarantee of freedom. The woman cast a shy glance full of constraint at Ramsay. "I reckon you'll be going back up to the cabin," she said, along with the bull cart. "There's bread in the tin box set in on the shelf. I put the bacon in the bee island pot to keep the hounds from getting it. Don't forget to wind the clock tonight." "You air a-goin' to your brother Ed's?" asked Ramsay with fine unconcern. "I was lowin' to get along up there afore night. I ain't sayin' as they'll pester theyselves any to make me welcome, but I hain't now har else fur to go. It's a right smart ways, and I reckon I better be goin'. I'll be a-sayin' goodbye, Rance, that is, if you keer fur to say so." "I don't know as anybody's a hound dog," said Ramsay in a martyr's voice, "fur to not want to say goodbye, less you air so anxious to get away that you don't want me to say it." Ariella was silent. She folded the $5 bill and her decree carefully and placed them in the bosom of her dress. Benajah Widdop watched the money disappear with mournful eyes behind his spectacles. And then with his next words he achieved rank, as his thoughts ran, with either the great crowd of the world's sympathizers or the little crowd of its great financiers. "Be kind o' lonesome in the old cabin tonight, Rance," he said. Ramsay Bilbrough stared out at the Cumberlands, clear blue now in the sunlight. He did not look at Ariella. "I low it might be lonesome," he said, "but when folks gets mad and wants a devotee, you can't make folks stay." "There's others wanted a devotee," said Ariella, speaking to the wooden stool. "Besides, nobody don't want nobody to stay." "Nobody never said they didn't." "Nobody never said they did. I reckon I better start on now to Brother Ed's. Nobody can't wind that old clock. Want me to go back along with you in the cart and wind it fur you, Rance?" The mountaineer countenance was proof against emotion, but he reached out a big hand and enclosed Ariella's thin brown one. Her soul peeped out once through her impassive face, hallowing it. "Them hounds shan't pester you no more," said Ramsay. "I reckon I been mean and low down. You win that clock, Ariella." "My heart hits in that cabin, Rance," she whispered. "Along with you. I ain't a-goin' to get mad no more. Lees be startin', Rance, so's we can get home by sundown." Justice of the Peace Benajah Widdop interposed as they started for the door, forgetting his presence. "In the name of the state of Tennessee," he said, "I forbid you all to be a-defyin' of its laws and statutes. This coat is immo than willin' and full of joy to see the clouds of discord and misunderstandin' rollin' away from two lovin' hearts, but it air the duty of the coat to preserve the morals and integrity of the state. The coat reminds you that you air no longer man and wife, but air said by regular decree, and as such air not entitled to the benefits and pertenances of the matrimonial estate." Ariella caught Ramsay's arm. Did those words mean that she must lose him now when they had just learned the lesson of life? But the coat heir prepared, went on the justice, for to remove the disabilities set up by the decree of divorcee. The coat heir on hand to perform the solemn ceremony of marriage, thus fixin' things up and enabling the parties in the case to resume the honorably and elevatin' state of matrimony which they desires. The fee for performing said ceremony will be, in this case, to wit, $5. Arikla caught the gleam of promise in his words. Swiftly her hand went to her bosom. Freely as an alighting dove the bill fluttered to the justice's table. Her sallow cheek colored as she stood hand in hand with Ramsay and listened to the reuniting words. Ramsay helped her into the cart and climbed in beside her. The little Red Bull turned once more, and they set out, hand-clasped, for the mountains. Justice of the Peace Benaja Widdop sat in his door and took off his shoes. Once again he fingered the bill tucked down in his vest pocket. Once again he smoked his elder-stem pipe. Once again the speck-led hen swaggered down the main street of the settlement, cackling foolishly. The Voice of the City, by O. Henry. 25 years ago the schoolchildren used to chant their lessons. The manner of their delivery was a sing-song recitative between the utterance of an Episcopal minister and the drone of a tired sawmill. I mean no disrespect. We must have lumber and sawdust. I remember one beautiful and instructive little lyric that emanated from the physiology class. The most striking line of it was this: "The shin bone is the longest bone in the human body." What an inestimable boon it would have been if all the corporeal and spiritual facts pertaining to man had thus been tunefully and logically inculcated in our youthful minds. But what we gained in anatomy, music, and philosophy was meager. The other day I became confused. I needed a ray of light. I turned back to those school days for aid. But in all the nasal harmonies we whined forth from those barred benches, I could not recall one that treated of the voice of agglomerated mankind. In other words, of the composite vocal message of massed humanity. In other words, of the voice of a big city. Now, the individual voice is not lacking. We can understand the song of the poet, the ripple of the brook, the meaning of the man who wants $5 until next Monday, the inscriptions on the tombs of the pharaohs, the language of flowers, the step lively of the conductor, and the prelude of the milk cans at 4 a.m. Certain large-eared ones even assert that they are wise to the vibrations of the tympanum pro, kneed by concussion of the air emanating from Mr. H. James. But who can comprehend the meaning of the voice of the city? I went out for to see. First, I asked Aurelia. She wore white Swiss and a bat with flowers on it, and ribbons and ends of things fluttered here and there. "Tell me," I said, stammeringly, for I have no voice of my own, "what does this big, enormous, whopping city say? It must have a voice of some kind. Does it ever speak to you? How do you interpret its meaning? It is a tram-in, does mass, but it must have a key." "Like a Saratoga trunk?" asked Aurelia. "No," said I. "Please do not refer to the lid. I have a fancy that every city has a voice. Each one has something to say to the one who can hear it. What does the big one say to you?" "All cities," said Aurelia, judicially, "say the same thing. When they get through saying it, there is an echo from Philadelphia. So, they are unanimous." "Here are 4 million people," said I, scholastic ally, "compressed upon an island, which is mostly land surrounded by Wall Street water. The conjunction of so many units into so small a space must result in an identity, or rather a homogeneity that finds its oral expression through a common channel. It is, as you might say, a consensus of translation, concentrating in a crystallized, general idea which reveals itself in what may be termed the voice of the city. Can you tell me what it is?" Aurelia smiled wonderfully. She sat on the high stoop. A spray of insolent ivy bobbed against her right ear. A ray of impudent moonlight flickered upon her nose. But I was adamant, nickel-plated. "I must go and find out," I said. "What is the voice of this city? Other cities have voices. It is an assignment. I must have it. New York, icon, tinned, in a rising tone, had better not hand me a cigar and say, 'Old man, I can't talk for publication.' No other city acts in that way. Chicago says, unhesitatingly, 'I will.' Philadelphia says, 'I should.' New Orleans says, 'I used to.' Louisville says, 'Don't care if I do.' St. Louis says, 'Excuse me.' Pittsburgh says, 'Smoke up.' Now, New York." Aurelia smiled. "Very well," said I. "I must go elsewhere and find out." I went into a palace, tile-floored, cherub-ceilinged and square with the cop. I put my foot on the brass rail and said to Billy Magnus, the best bartender in the diocese, "Billy, You've lived in New York a long time. What kind of a song and dance does this old town give you? What I mean is, doesn't the gab of it seem to kind of bunch up and slide over the bar to you in a sort of amalgamated tip that bits off the berg in a kind of an epigram with a dash of bitters and a slice of... "Excuse me a minute," said Billy. "Somebody's punching the button at the side door." He went away, came back with an empty tin bucket, again vanished with it full, returned and said to me, "That was Mame. She rings twice. She likes a glass of beer for supper. Her and the kid. If you ever saw that little skisix of mine brace up in his high chair and take his beer and... But, say, what was yours? I get kind of excited when I bear them 2 rings. Was it the baseball score or gin fizz you asked for?" "Ginger ale," I answered. I walked up to Broadway. I saw a cop on the COR. The cops take kids up, women across, and men in. I went up to him. "If I'm not exceeding the spiel limit," I said, "let me ask you. You see New York during its vocative hours. It is the function of you and your brother cops to preserve the acoustics of the city. There must be a civic voice that is intelligible to you. At night during your lonely rounds you must have beard it. What is the epitome of its turmoil and shouting? What does the city say to you?" "Friend," said the policeman, spinning his club, "it don't say nothing. I get my orders from the man higher up. Say, I guess you're all right. Stand here for a few minutes and keep an eye open for the roundsman." The cop melted into the darkness of the side street. In 10 minutes B had returned. "Married last Tuesday," B said, half gruffly. "You know how they are. She comes to that corner at 9 every night for A. Comes to say hello. I generally manage to be there. Say, what was it you asked me a bit ago? What's doing in the city?" "Oh, there's a roof garden or 2 just opened, 12 blocks up." I crossed a crow's foot of streetcar tracks and skirted the edge of an umbrageous park. An artificial Diana, gilded, heroic, poised, wind-ruled, on the tower, shimmered in the clear light of her namesake in the sky. Along came my poet, hurry, ing, hatted, haired, emitting dactyls, spondees, and dactylus. I seized him. "Bill," said I, in the magazine he is clean, "give me a lift. I am on an assignment to find out the voice of the city. You see, it's a special order. Narrowly a symposium comprising the views of Henry Clews, John L. Sullivan, Edwin Markham, May Ir, Wynne and Charles Schwab would be about all. But this is a different matter. We want a broad, poetic, mystic vocalization of the city's soul and meaning. You are the very chap to give me a hint. Some years ago a man got at the Niagara Falls and gave us its pitch. The note was about 2 feet below the lowest G on the piano. Now, you can't put New York into a note unless it's better endorsed than that. But give me an idea of what it would say if it should speak. It is bound to be a mighty and far-reaching utterance. To arrive at it we must take the tremendous crash of the chords of the day's traffic, the laughter and music of the night, the solemn tones of Dr. Parkhurst, the ragtime, the weeping, the stealthy bum of cab-beals, the shout of the press agent, the tinkle of fountains on the roof gardens, the hullabaloo of the strawberry vendor and the covers of everybody's magazine, the whispers of the lovers in the parks. All these sounds must go into your voice, not combined, but mixed and of the mixture and essence made, and of the sense and extract, an audible extract, of which one drop shall form the thing we seek. Do you remember, asked the poet with a chuckle, that California girl we met at Stiver's studio last week? Well, I'm on my way to see her. She repeated that poem of mine, the tribute of spring, word for word. She's the smartest proposi tie-in in this town just at present. Say, how does this confounded tie look? I spoiled 4 before I got one to set right. And the voice that I asked you about? I inquired. Oh, she doesn't sing, said Clean, but you ought to bear her recite My Angel of the Inshore Wind. I passed on. I cornered a newsboy and be flashed at me prophetic pink papers that outstripped the news by 2 revolutions of the clock's longest hand. Son, I said, while I pretended to chase coins in my penny pocket, doesn't it sometimes seem to you as if the city ought to be able to talk? All these ups and downs and funny business and queer things hap. Pinning every day, what would it say? Do you think, if it could speak? Quit your kiddin', said the boy. What paper yer want? I got no time to waste. It's Mag's birthday, and I want 30 cents to get her a present. Here was no interpreter of the city's mouthpiece. I bought a paper and consigned its undeclared treaties, its premeditated murders and unfought pleas to an ash can. Again I repaired to the park and sat in the moonshade. I thought and wondered why none could tell me what I asked for. And then, as swift as light from a fixed star, the answer came to me. I arose and hurried as so many reasoners must, back around my circle. I knew the answer and I bugged it in my breast as I flew, fearing lest someone would stop me and demand my secret. Aurelia was still on the stoop. The moon was higher and the ivy shadows were deeper. I sat at her side and we watched a little cloud tilt at the drifting moon and go asunder, quite pale and discomfited. And then, wonder of wonders and delight of delights, our hands somehow touched, and our fingers closed together and did not part. After half an hour Aurelia said, with that smile of hers, "Do you know, you haven't spoken a word since you came back?" "That," said I, nodding wisely, "is the voice of the city." The Vitagraphoscope, by O. Henry. Vaudeville is intrinsically episodic and discontinuous. Its audiences do not demand denouements. Sufficient unto each turn is the evil thereof. No one cares how many romances the singing comedienne may have had if she can capably sustain the limelight and a high note or two. The audience is wrecked not if the performing dogs get to the pound the moment they have jumped through their last hoop. They do not desire bulletins about the possible injuries received by the comic cyclist who retires headfirst from the stage in a crash of property, chinaware. Neither do they consider that their seat coupons entitle them to be instructed whether or no there is a sentiment between the lady solo banjoist and the Irish monologist. Therefore, let us have no lifting of the curtain upon a tableau of the united lovers, background by defeated villainy and derogated by the comic, osculating maid and butler, thrown in as a sop to the Cerberus of the 50-cent seats. But our program ends with a brief turn or two, and then to the exits. Whoever sits the show out may find, if he will, the slender thread that binds together, though ever so slightly, the story that, perhaps, only the walrus will understand. Extracts from a letter from the first vice president of the Republic Insurance Company of New York City to Frank Goodwin of Coralio, Republic of Ancuria. My dear Mr. Goodwin, your communication per Messrs. Howland and Forchett of New Orleans has reached us. Also their draft on New York for $100,000, the amount abstracted from the funds of this company by the late J. Churchill Warfield, its former president. The officers and directors unite in requesting me to express to you their sincere esteem and thanks for your prompt and much appreciated return of the entire missing sum within 2 weeks from the time of its disappearance. Can assure you that the matter will not be allowed to receive the least publicity. Regret exceedingly the distressing death of Mr. Warfield by his own hand, but congratulations on your marriage to Miss Warfield. Many charms, winning manners, noble and womanly nature, and envied position in the best metropolitan society. Cordially yours, Lucius E. Applegate, first Vice President, the Republic Insurance Company. The Vitagraphoscope, Moving Pictures, The Last Sausage. Seen in artist's studio. The artist, a young man of prepossessing appearance, sits in a dejected attitude, amid a litter of sketches, with his head resting upon his hand. An oil stove stands on a pine box in the center of the studio. The artist rises, tightens his waist belt to another hole, and lights the stove. He goes to a tin bread box, half hidden by a screen, takes out a solitary link of sausage, turns the box upside down to show that there is no more, and chucks the sausage into a frying pan, which he sets upon the stove. The flame of the stove goes out, showing that there is no more oil. The artist, in evident despair, seizes the sausage, in a sudden access of rage, and hurls it violently from him. At the same time a door opens, and a man who enters receives the sausage forcibly against his nose. He seems to cry out, and is observed to make a dance step or two, vigorously. The newcomer is a ruddy-faced, active, keen-looking man, apparently of Irish ancestry. Next he is observed to laugh immoderately. He kicks over the stove. He claps the artist, who is vainly striving to grasp his hand, vehemently upon the back. Then he goes through a pantomime which to the sufficiently intelligent spectator reveals that he has acquired large sums of money by trading pot metal hatchets and razors to the Indians of the Cordillera Mountains for gold dust. He draws a roll of money as large as a small loaf of bread from his pocket and waves it above his head, while at the same time he makes pantomime of drinking from a glass. The artist hurriedly secures his hat, and the two leave the studio together. The writing on the sands. Seen the beach at Nice. A woman, beautiful, still young, exquisitely clothed, complacent, poised, reclines near the water, idly scrawling letters in the sand with the staff of her silken parasol. The beauty of her face is audacious. Her languid pose is one that you feel to be impermanent. You wait, expectant, for her to spring or glide or crawl, like a panther that has unaccountably become stock still. She idly scrawls in the sand, and the word that she always writes is Isabel. A man sits a few yards away. You can see that they are companions, ever if no longer comrades. His face is dark and smooth, and almost inscrutable but not quite. The two speak little together. The man also scratches on the sand with his cane, and the word that he writes is Anchuria. And then he looks out where the Mediterranean and the sky intermingle with death in his gaze. The wilderness and thou. Seen, the borders of a gentleman's estate in a tropical land. An old Indian, with a mahogany-colored face, is trimming the grass on a grave by a mangrove swamp. Presently he rises to his feet and walks slowly toward a grove that is shaded by the gathering, brief twilight. In the edge of the grove stands a man who is stalwart, with a kind and courteous air, and a woman of a serene and clear-cut loveliness. When the old Indian comes up to them, the man drops money in his hand. The grave tender, with the stolid pride of his race, takes it as his due and goes his way. The two in the edge of the grove turn back along the dim pathway and walk close, close, for, after all, what is the world at its best but a little round field of the moving pictures with two walking together in it?